All right, so first portion of the stream here, doing matchup guide number 4. So we've done 4-color Yorion, we've done Rhinos, we did, what did we do last time? Hammer Time. Pretty sure Hammer Time. I can't remember, it'll be up on YouTube soon. Either way, we're doing Burn this time. So, Death Shadow versus Burn, one of my favorite matchups in all of Modern. Really excited to do this specific guide. So, let's talk about a little bit of the Game 1 stuff. Was it Hammer yesterday? Alright, so I wasn't going crazy. A little bit of the Game 1. On the Burn side, their game, obviously, get you from 20 to 0 fast as possible. Or as efficiently as possible. I actually really hate that when people say that the point of Burn is to kill your opponent as quickly as possible, because I think that is a huge mistake and underappreciation of the Burn archetype. I think a more effective way of putting it is Burn wants to put you from 20 to 0 as efficiently as possible. And the only difference that means is, first of all, maximizing the mana to damage ratio. So trying to get the most damage out of every mana that you tap. It doesn't have to be quickly. You could choose not to tap a land, and that's still maximizing efficiency. But as soon as you start wasting burn spells, like tapping mana, casting burn spells into like obvious counter magic, or in situations that your opponent can counter on your turn and then untap and then counter again, then that's getting away from that kill your opponent as efficiently as possible and moving more towards the trying to kill as fast as possible. And I think that's where a lot of the breakdown occurs. So Burn players lose a lot of games by not going to face. Yeah, but they also lose a lot of games by going to face when they don't need to. So as like a Shadow player, plenty of times my opponent's gone like Lava Spike, Lightning Bolt to face, Skewer you, and then I untap and play double Shadow and the game's over. And it's like, alright, you didn't need to do that right now, but you were trying to kill me as fast as possible instead of killing me as efficiently as possible. And they ended up losing because of it. So in Game 1 is typically that a little more skewed towards the fastest possible aspect, where it's, hey, here's my creatures, here's my burn spells, you gotta stop it or I'm gonna kill you. From the Shadow side, Game 1 and Games 2 and 3, but especially Game 1, we're the control deck. We're not the beatdown deck. The sooner you realize that, usually the better. But if you're on like a variation of Shadow with cards like Temur Battle Rage, then that can get flipped a little bit. You can have more situations where your opponent's turn 1 Swift Spear is met with like a Fetch Shock Thoughtseize on your side, and then they bolt you to the face, and you untap and go Shadow Removal spell, and now your opponent's got to do 6 damage to you or so, 7 damage to you in that one turn, or you're untapping with like Temur Battle Rage Stubborn Denial. And the matchup gets out of hand, but it's very hand dependent. But for the most part, in most variations of Shadow, outside of those extreme circumstances, Burn's the aggro deck, Shadow's the control deck. Your goal is just to try to extend the game, stabilize, and use your counter spells, use your interaction for creatures to let your dudes get through in just like a couple swings to close out the game. Some giveaways that your opponent's on Burn, obviously like turn 1 Goblin Guide is probably the biggest giveaway outside of turn 1 Lava Spike or turn 1 Suspend Rift Bolt. Swift Spear, there's a few more variations that it could be. Like, there's a few Prowess decks running around. There's the occasional, like, Rakdos deck with Scourge of the Skyclaves that run Swift Spear. So that might not be the auto I'm against Burn. but Goblin Guide, Lava Spike are both almost exclusively burn. Same thing with like turn 1 Suspend Rift Bolt. So any of those signs kind of means, hey, I need to back on the brakes a little bit. On the Shadow side, once you realize that you are up against burn, goal number 1, again, should be life total management, unless you've just got a ridiculously quick Thoughtseize Shadow Battle Rage hand. And when I say ridiculously quick, I mean like if you do not specifically have the cards Thoughtseize, Death Shadow, Teamer Battle Rage, and probably something like Street Wraith or Lightning Bolt, I would not recommend going on the hyper-aggressive train. Like, don't plan on drawing into a Shadow or a Battle Rage or something like that. But throw the Lightning Bolt in there, because there's a lot of situations where, like, you've got turn 1 Fetch Shock Thoughtseize, turn 2 Fetch Shock Shadow, and your opponent has that one turn to make the decision of bolt the Shadow or bolt my opponent. And if they go to bolt the Shadow, you want to be able to bolt yourself, save the Shadow, keep going forward with that game plan of Teamer Battle Rage being lethal. So it's just something to keep in mind with there. Out of like the stock Grixis lists and stuff nowadays, goal number 1 should be creature management. So making sure they're not swinging in, sticking Eidolons, anything like that. Goal number 2 should be finding Drown in the Locks to try to save yourself off those last couple points of burn. And then goal number 3, obviously, get a Death Shadow. But since these decks are way less geared to having Shadow as just like a straight up I win button in some games, life total management just becomes a lot more important. And the best way to control the life total aspect is to keep their creatures from tagging you multiple times. Alright, so post board. This is where things get a little weirder. So we're just going to take like some kind of stereotypical burn lists and kind of look at what they're boarding in, and then we'll kind of look at what we're boarding in. So if we're on like a stock Grixis list, cards like Searing Blaze are a lot more interactive on our opponent's side. Kills Ragavan, kills Dragon's Rage Chandler. If they're on the play, can kill Ledger Shredder on curve very effectively. So those sort of like burn and kill a dude effects are pretty rough. Sanctifier on Vex 1 you almost always see coming in. Path to Exile usually in some number. They love bringing in Deflecting Palm. I don't think it's like a good card against Shadow. It's okay, but I would much rather bring this in against something else that's not playing the interactive game. Because between the hand disruption and the counter spells, like Deflecting Palm is very rarely going to do what you want it to do. I've seen some bring in Roiling Vortex. I don't think that one's really where you want to be. Like obviously it's okay on turn 2, but turn 2 is kind of an important turn where you need to be looking at like Eidolon, Double Burn Spell, Sanctifier, Boros Charm, and I think Roiling Vortex is just so far down on that turn 2 tier list that I usually don't consider it to be something I'm geared for or playing to, and a lot of the times it's more detrimental to the burn player than it is the shadow player, especially if the card Death Shadow is in hand or easily accessible. Board outs. I see a lot of times they'll board out like Goblin Guide, some number of the creatures, and try to max out spells. I think that's right from the burn side. I think the creatures are okay, but I'm a lot more scared of spell-heavy hands than creature-heavy hands. As far as spells coming out, Skullcrack is one they can cut pretty easily. Searing Blaze if you're not on like Ragavans and Dragon's Rage Chandlers. But I think nowadays they kind of assume everybody is and are probably just leaving those in more often than not. Cards like Lava Spike are a little bit on the weaker end since they can't hit creatures. So some number of those effects for some number of Sanctifier and Vec, Path to Exile. From the Shadow side, cards like Flusterstorm and Spell Pierce are like our S tier bring-ins. These are the things we always want access to. Mystical Dispute is okay if you're just looking for like a bad mana leak in the matchup. It's perfectly reasonable on like turn 3, 4, 5 to trade your 3 mana counterspell down for like a 2 mana burn spell, Boros Charm, Lightning Helix, whatever it is. And that's not the worst deal in the world for you. Engineered Explosives is one I recommend bringing in more often than not. Like, if they do have a go-wide hand, it's good. If they've got Whirling Vortex, it's an answer to that. Sanctifier on Vec, it's an answer to that. Terminate and K-Command are both options. I'd rather have K-Command than Terminate, just for the discard effect. Being able to tag like a sorcery speed spell on their draw step is always nice. And you have to be careful of these random burn players that'll run like Ensnaring Bridge in their sideboard, and they'll just board out most of their creatures and bring in like a whole bunch of extra burn spells from their sideboard, like Exquisite Firecrafts, Whirling Vortex, stuff like that, and then Ensnaring Bridge. And you don't want to just have a no-outer to that. Like, even if you don't bring in all your EEs, K-commands, whatever, I would bring in at least one of them somewhere so you have that potential out. Main deck things that I'm cutting. Ledger Shredder's a little on the weaker side. Expressive Iteration's a little slow, a little clunky. Maybe a Terminate if I wanted to trim down to cheaper removal. Hand Disruption's always one people are asking about. I like to keep most of my Hand Disruption in, whether that be 2 or 3 Thoughtseize. But I think the information that you gain off Thoughtseize is a lot more relevant than people give it credit for. Like knowing that you need to play around Deflecting Palm, or knowing your opponent's got a path to exile, whatever, gives you a lot of room to navigate those first few turns. And if you do trade a Thoughtseize for a burn spell, every burn spell in their deck is dealing at least 3. So Thoughtseize is quote-unquote gaining a life whenever you're able to trade the 2 damage on your end for 3 damage on theirs. Because if you didn't have the Thoughtseize, then they would be able to cast and potentially resolve their spell. So, just something to keep in mind. So, other variations of Shadow outside of Grixis. Let's take a look at like a Jund list, for example. Some of the easy board outs are like Wrenn and 6, some of this more expensive interaction because you really want to slim down. Common board ends. Like, you're a little more likely to board out something like Thoughtseize in a list like this because you've already got Inquisition as well. But some number of this expensive stuff coming out is pretty easy. Board ends could be like Abrupt Decay. It's a good answer for the potential Ensnaring Bridge, as well as answering any troublesome creature outside of Sanctifier on Vec. EE's a big bring in here. You could bring in Chalice of the Void if you're really wanting to rely on Kroxa, Tarmogoyf to kind of get you across the finish line. Turok is one that I'll bring in a lot of the time. If you play conservatively those first few turns, answer creatures, then Turok can come down and often be like a 3-for-1 because your opponent's more likely to want to spend a removal spell on the Turok and then throw like a couple burn spells at face if they've got them, or if not, lose them, in which case Turok coming down as a 4-3, eating a removal spell, getting 2 cards out of hand can be a really big turnaround. Especially if your opponent's like not hitting land drops and is playing out creatures. So, for example, turn 1, Ragavan, opponent plays Swift Spear, swings in, or just sits back. Turn 2, removal spell, hit with Ragavan. Turn 3, kick Turok, can often be lights out. And Turok just gets to keep swinging through things like Sanctifier on Vec. Important to note that Turok can be hit with Deflecting Palm, since Deflecting Palm does not target. So, remember that. What else do we have? So let's look at some of the other variations. So, like Dimir, pretty easy cuts are things like the Street Wraiths that are just life loss, but not really a beneficial effect. Stubborn Denial can come in, Chalice of the Void can come in, EE or Mystical Dispute if, again, you want that bad mana leak effect. Turok's a possibility if you want to trim on something like Thoughtseize, maybe trim on a Murktide, whatever the case may be. You can pretty easily find an answer for that. If you're playing Dimir against Burn, your goal is more often than not to get to Murktide. So, like, Consider, Stubborn Denial, Counterspell, Drown, all of these are just, like, S-tier cards in the matchup, except for Dress Down. So, being able to cast a lot of these interactive spells early just naturally gets you to a reasonable size Murktide, and that's often going to close the game out in, like, 2 turns. So, that's usually how that one goes. We'll talk about Rakdos a lot. Pretty good burn matchup here between like Grief and Malakir Rebirth or something, getting a couple copies of burn spells. Shadow, if they do decide to get aggressive. You've got Fury for creatures, gets around Eidolon triggers. And then you've just got like a bunch of cheap removal and interaction. So, pretty solid there. Let's see, Sultai is a build I've been messing around with. Tarmogoyf, post board, is probably your best threat. It gets to keep attacking through Firewalker, Sanctifier on Vec. Core Firewalker too, but Sanctifier especially. And it's typically going to take multiple burn spells to kill it. It doesn't require you to lower your life total to get down. So it's kind of like your priority 1 threat keep if you have it, since you get to just jam it on turn 2, not have to worry about holding stuff up. Naval's like Stubborn Denial, great with Drown in the Loch. Alright, so let's talk about Battle Rage variants in the burn matchup real quick, because this is something that I kind of alluded to earlier but didn't really get into too much. 9 times out of 10, Death Shadow is going to be the control deck in the matchup. And I mentioned that there were times where you would have a hand that's just hyper aggressive, and you want to capitalize on that. What I mean is these hands of like double fetch land, Street Wraith, Shadow, Thoughtseize, Battle Rage, Lightning Bolt, Stubborn Denial, Drown and Lock, something like that. But it's the hands where, alright, if my opponent leads on a turn 1 creature, and I lead on a turn 1 like Fetch Shock Thoughtseize, and then their turn 2, they hit me, or they play a bunch of burn spells, whatever, I get to untap with Shadow on turn 2, and all I have to do is survive from that turn 2 to turn 3, and Battle Rage is more than likely going to take me across the finish line. Those are the kind of hands that I'm talking about. And again, notifying features, you need to have ways to aggressively lower your life total. You cannot rely on your opponent lowering your life total. So if you keep a hand with like basic swamp, Steam Vents or something, Inquisition, Street Wraith, Battle Rage, Shadow, that's probably not going to get you there, because you're giving your opponent too much time to be able to draw interaction, to be able to draw more burn spells, to let their creatures just chip in for damage while you do nothing. Like, no, you need to be able to push the envelope with getting that Shadow down, getting it protected, and untapping on that turn 3, maybe turn 4 with a lethal attack. And I think that's something that a lot of Shadow players will kind of overlook in the early days of the burn matchup. Like, they'll treat every match against burn like it's supposed to be that. It's supposed to be Fetch Shock Thoughtseize, Fetch Shock, have a Shadow. But like that 1/1 Shadow with no protection isn't doing you any good. That 1/1 Shadow that can't end the game immediately probably isn't doing you that much good. So you've got to be really, really careful of like picking and choosing those hands that you're going to go for that line with. Is there anything else? Croxa's an excellent card in the matchup. I've seen some people on like Facebook talking about boarding Croxa out against Burn, and I can understand maybe boarding out one if you're really concerned about Sanctifier on Vec, but otherwise Croxa on turn 2, ditch a Burn spell, play interaction on 3, escape Croaks on 4 is like a great way to get 2 spells or 2 cards out of your opponent's hand, plus present a real clock that they have to deal with, or they're going to start losing cards out of hand, and that's kind of the end goal of the matchup, is to get your opponent empty-handed, get them into top deck mode, so that things like Drown in the Lock, Spell Pierce, Flusterstorm, whatever, can really take over the game at that point. I know there was one other point I was going to make real quick. Favored or unfavored. This is the scale I always tell people. If you've had other experiences, then more than happy to hear about them. But the way I always explain it is, if you have 2 people who are inexperienced in the matchup, Burn and Shadow, Burn is usually favored. And the reason for that is the Burn player is more likely to assume their role is to just throw Burn spells at their opponent. Just fire them off, keep going until your opponent's dead. And more often than not, that will get there if the Shadow player is like doing any unintentional damage to themselves or not being considerate of their life total. If you've got a good Burn player versus a new Shadow player in the matchup, then Burn is even more favored. If you've got a mainly because they know when to hold back spells and let the Shadow player kind of deal damage to themselves. If you've got a good Shadow player and a good Burn player, it's really close to 50-50. Obviously, it depends on the Shadow variant. Like one of these heavy Temur Battle Rage Street Wraith lists, it's going to be a little unfavored for Shadow. Where some of the old school Shadow lists, like Gurmag, Stubborn and all, it's going to be favored for Shadow. The stock Grixis list nowadays, it's pretty favored for Burn, just because cards like Searing Blaze are 10 times better in this matchup than they were in previous ones. But the higher up in skill level of the 2 players you get, the closer it gets to 50-50. I still think it favors Burn more often than not, but a really, really good Shadow player can flip the script a little bit, and you kind of have like this inverse bell curve of the matchup on the Burn side. Like if you've got a Burn player that's just starting, they're like right here. As they get better, it gets worse for them, because they start turning into like, okay, I need to hold things back when I shouldn't be holding things back. I'm going to start hitting creatures when I shouldn't be hitting creatures. And it turns into a lot more favorable on the Shadow side there. Like I'm making bad sideboarding, or on the Burn side, I'm making bad sideboarding choices, boarding out too many Burn spells, too many creatures, boarding in ineffective cards, and then as like the Burn player gets better, then it starts curving back up to where it like passes that median line, the 50-50 line. So that's kind of the best way to describe it. Starts off good for Burn, they get better, it drops down to bad for Burn, they get even better, it goes back over into like good territory. And you just have to be prepared for all sorts of stuff. But like on the Shadow side, my recommendation is always make sure you have some sort of catch-all in the deck, whether it be engineered explosives or something similar to that effect. Something that can hit Ensnaring Bridge, can hit Sanctifier on Vec, Whirling Vortex. Like, if you don't choose for Engineered Explosives, then have, like, K-Command plus something like Dress Down, so you can interact with Sanctifier at least at once if you happen to draw that Dress Down. Again, anytime your opponent's got something like Rest in Peace, could be annoying for some variation, so like having EE in the deck is worthwhile. But all I'm trying to say is a lot of these random burn decks will have something that they'll juke into, and you just want to make sure that you've got some sort of catch-all answer to that. Like, I don't want to sift through all these burn decks, but it's a lot more than you think would have things like Ensnaring Bridge. So, just don't leave yourself, like, stone cold to it if you can help it. If you're on, like, one of these Stubborn Denial builds, Gurmag Shadow, Stubborn Denial, all that stuff, then Ensnaring Bridge is a lot less problematic since you just have, like, a clean answer to a 3-mana sorcery speed card. But one of the worst ways that you can fall victim to cards like that is trying to fight over your opponent's creatures, like, on their main phase, or on their first main phase, or in combat. So if your opponent has, like, a Swift Spear or something, and you've got a Drown in the Loch, let's say they went Fetch Shock Swift Spear on turn 1. Turn 2, they played a fetch land. They're attacking with their Swift Spear. Now they've created this scenario that if I interact with the Swift Spear, if I Fatal Push, if I Bolt whatever, then maybe second main phase, they go Fetch, Shock, put in a Sanctifier on Vec, and get around my Drown in the Loch, or whatever I've got. So it's probably better for you to just take the one. If they want to commit more spells to the Swift Spear, then you can interact with it since they can't drop the 2-drop down. But more often than not, it's going to be better to just, like, fight over that card on their instep, or fight over that card at a point where you can still hold up mana for one of the more interactive things, or one of the more problematic permanents. And cards like Sanctifier, Ensnaring Bridge, Whirling Vortex are another reason that I like keeping in Hand Disruption a good bit, game 2 and 3. Like, just having that turn 1 interaction. And if you have, like, a Death Shadow or something in your hand, you're a lot more likely to be okay with going turn 1 Thoughtseize into their turn 1 creature, since you know you've got, like, a little bit of a cushion with your threat. So that's about it for the burn matchup. So let's